Hello again. Mitzvah say, we've got a positive commandment, Shekol Echad Mi Yisrael, that everyone in Israel, Yichtov Lo Sefer Torah, should write a Torah for themselves. Before we go any further, this sounds like a very challenging mitzvah, because a Sefer Torah new starts at about $40,000 and then goes up from there. That's a pretty heavy obligation. But we're going to talk about different ways that you can fulfill this obligation other than literally writing a Sefer Torah from start to finish. Okay, let's look inside. It is a positive commandment that everyone in Jewry should write a Torah scroll for himself. For Scripture says, "Now therefore write this song," which the sages explain to mean, write the Torah that contains this song. For one is not to write the Torah in separate sections. If a person writes it with his own hand, Scripture reckons it for him as though he received it from Mount Sinai. If it is not possible for him to write it himself, and by the way, that requires highly specialized training and takes a long time to write a Sefer Torah from start to finish. So, if it is not possible for him to write it himself, he has to buy it or hire someone to write it for him. Even if he has a Torah scroll from his forefathers, it is a religious duty to write his own. However, if a person corrects one letter in a Torah scroll, which was defective presumably, it is as though he wrote the entire Torah. Right? We'll talk about this more shortly. Now, Rav Asher of blessed memory wrote that all this applied in the early generations when they would write a Torah scroll and study from it. In our days, however, when a Torah scroll is written and placed in the synagogue, to read from it in public during congregational prayer, it is a positive commandment for everyone in Jewry who has the means to buy Chumashim, Mishnah, and Talmud, and their commentaries, so that he and his children, sons it says here, might meditate in them. For the religious duty of writing a Torah scroll is in order to have it studied, and through the Talmud and its commentaries, he will know the meaning of the mitzvot and the laws thoroughly. Therefore, these are the volumes that a man is commanded to have written or printed in our time. Well, whoever has it in his power to fulfill both of them, both interpretations of the commandment, in its plain sense, fortunate is his lot. It applies in every place and time, for men, but not for women. Okay, so we have a mitzvah to write a Torah scroll. The purpose of writing a Torah scroll was to study from the Torah scroll. Nowadays, says the Rabbeinu Asher, the Rosh, who is a major authority, one of the Balei Tosfos, a Tosafist. So the Rosh says, nowadays, that's not how we study Torah. So however we study Torah nowadays, a person is obligated to purchase those things from which we study Torah nowadays. So this is a very simple mitzvah to fulfill. Get out there and buy a chumash. Go to Tuvya's or your favorite farm store and buy a chumash, if you haven't already. Buy a chumash, buy commentaries, buy Jewish books. Buying Jewish books is the equivalent of writing a Sefer Torah. Again, the purpose of writing a Sefer Torah here is for its study. Therefore, anything that we buy for the purpose of studying Judaism fulfills this commandment. Furthermore, you'll note that we said earlier that anybody who writes a single letter in a Sefer Torah, it's as if they fulfilled the commandment. Therefore, what you often see is people will join together, and instead of somebody spending $40,000, you get, 80 people spend $500, and each one of them writes a letter in the Sefer Torah. So if you've been at one of these ceremonies, right, so what will the Sefer do? The Sefer will outline the letters, and then the purchaser will fill in the letters, and in that way they wrote the Sefer Torah, and in that way they have fulfilled the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah. This is a tremendous, wonderful mitzvah to be involved in. And if you can be part of something like that, great. At the very least, let's get out there, buy Chumashim, buy Sidurim, buy Jewish books of any sort, Hebrew, English, it doesn't matter. Find a way to study Torah, and you too can fulfill the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah. Okay, we'll be back next time with our next mitzvah. Our next mitzvah is Listabek b'chachomim v'salmidehem. If we need to learn Torah, studying Torah is great, but it is a mitzvah to be attached to Torah scholars and their disciples so that we might learn from their examples. Well, we will take a look at that mitzvah next time. Thanks for being with us.